What's up everyone, you're Tapesh Kumar here and welcome back to Boeing Boy. The last of the Boeing 747, the queen of the skies, rolled out from the Boeing's Washington factory 2 days ago on the 9th of December 2022. And this will be the last 747 ever built. And today we'll look at why the Boeing 747 is so famous, why it's called the queen of the skies, and why it changed the face of aviation across the world forever. Let's get started. The Boeing 747 is an aircraft which does not need any introduction. I know आप सबको पहले ही पता है Boeing 747 कौन सा aircraft है. The Boeing 747 is basically a wide-body commercial jet aircraft. But very few people know that the Boeing 747 was not even a commercial aircraft. The initial design of the aircraft was actually for a military transport aircraft. So the US military had asked कि we need a huge big transport aircraft for carrying our military supplies here and there. So a lot of companies submitted their proposals. One of the proposals was Boeing, which was basically the original design of the 747. However, Boeing did not win that contract. But the Boeing company decided that we've spent so much money on developing the aircraft for the military and making its basic design, why not just put it into commercial production? As a result, the Boeing 747, instead of becoming a huge military transport jet aircraft, it became the world's most iconic, in my opinion, the most beautiful, and at that time, the biggest, by a huge margin, the biggest jet the world had ever seen. Now in the 1960s, air travel was just picking up. The airports were getting crowded and the aircraft which were currently in service were all very small aircrafts compared to the Boeing 747, such as the McDonnell Douglas DC-8 or the Boeing 707. Now these aircraft did not have a lot of range, plus they did not carry a lot of passengers. And what airlines thought was that if we could have a big aircraft which could carry a lot of passengers with a long range, we could just simply bring the cost per seat down, make the air tickets cheaper, and have more number of people traveling on one aircraft. Also, something interesting happened in the 1960s. Supersonic aircrafts were being developed, such as the Concorde. And it was very commonly thought at that time that supersonic aircrafts will become the norm, will become the standard for passenger travel. And the subsonic aircraft, such as the in-development Boeing 747, would not be used for passenger aircrafts because उस time पे supersonic का craze बहुत ज़्यादा होता था. As a result, Boeing also thought कि if our aircrafts will not be used for passenger service, at least we can have the 747 used for cargo services. Which is why, very interestingly, the cockpit of the Boeing 747, if you have seen, is on the upper deck. It's at a very high height from the ground और ऊपर installed है. The reason for that was very simple. Boeing wanted the aircraft design to be such that the nose of the aircraft could be lifted up and cargo could be put into the aircraft. As a result, the aircraft would also work for cargo airlines and passenger airlines still obviously thigh. Another problem that the aircraft faced was back in the 1960s, the engines used on aircrafts were called turbojets. Now these engines were not very fuel efficient. They did produce a lot of thrust, but fuel efficiency बहुत कम थी. So to make the aircraft a commercial success, Boeing and Pratt & Whitney, the company which manufactured the original engines for the 747, they had to come up with a brand new design known as the high bypass turbofan engine. This design of engines is used on every commercial aircraft nowadays, and it was pioneered on the Boeing 747. So Pratt & Whitney specially designed a brand new engine, a high bypass turbofan engine, which would produce same thrust as the turbojet engines of that time. However, it would only consume 1/3 of the fuel. So with a brand new engine design and an aircraft bigger than the wildest dreams of anyone back in those days, Boeing started work and started designing the Boeing 747. But the problem was the aircraft was so huge that Boeing did not have any plants big enough where they could manufacture such a huge aircraft. As a result, Boeing actually had to build a brand new factory just to manufacture the Boeing 747, the Everett factory. And till this date, the Everett factory of Boeing is the largest single building by volume ever across the world. And it was designed only and only to produce the Boeing 747. And so, with a brand new building, a brand new engine, and a brand new airframe design, Boeing showed the world the Boeing 747 for the first time at the Paris Air Show on 30th of September 1968. After a few initial hiccups, a few technical glitches here and there, which Boeing resolved very quickly, the aircraft first entered into service on the 22nd of January 1970, with Pan Am being the launch customer of the airline. Pan Am at that time was the biggest airline in the US. The first flight that the 747 did was from New York to London under Pan Am colors. And when the aircraft finally came into service, it changed the entire aviation industry forever. No one had thought that such a huge aircraft, which weighed over 350 tons, it could carry 500 passengers and still fly for hours and hours and actually make commercial sense. It brought the entire world closer together, and for the first time it was realized that you could have a big aircraft which could carry a lot of people and make a lot of economic viability. The 747, when it was introduced, set new standards for everything. The aircraft had 4 main landing gear bogies with 4 wheels on each main landing gear, and the aircraft was so strong that it could land on only 2 of those. So even if 2 of the landing gear bogies failed, the remaining 2 could handle the weight of the entire aircraft. There were redundancies built into the entire aircraft. There were 4 hydraulic systems. Every flight control on the aircraft, the rudder, aileron, elevator, everything, it had a backup, and it had twin surfaces for everything. So there were 2 flight controls for everything. So even if one failed, you still had the other one. And as the test pilot of the Boeing 747 put it, it was one of the best handling aircrafts ever produced. And believe me, till this date, it's a dream for majority of us to ever get to fly the 747. And the aircraft was extremely huge. The top of the rudder, the top of the tail of the aircraft is as high as a 6-story building. It has a wingspan of over 230 feet and it could carry over 500 passengers. The initial variants had a maximum takeoff weight of somewhere close to about 330 tons. That's 330,000 kgs of pure metal flying in the air with such beauty and such grace. One of the other reasons for the Boeing 747 getting its iconic image is because of that hump on the top. That little hump on the top, also known as the upper deck, is where the cockpit was, where the crew rest areas were, and where most airlines had their first class. And that was another level. Some of the older airlines, they configured their 747s to actually have cinemas, living rooms that you could book, not just a seat, a proper living room on board an aircraft while you're cruising at Mach 0.85, which also, by the way, was a very fast cruising speed at that time. After the original Boeing 747, which was called the 747-100, Boeing came out with multiple versions, many of which were cargo aircrafts. Eventually, Boeing came out with the last version of the 747, which was called the 747-8, and that is a truly spectacular aircraft. I'll give you some details about it. The 747-8 can carry as many as 605 passengers. The aircraft has a length of over 250 feet and a wingspan of almost 224 feet. The maximum takeoff weight of the aircraft is over 378 tons. The aircraft can carry a staggering 240,000 liters of fuel. The engines which were introduced on the Boeing 747-8 were called the GE Gen X engines. And each of those 4 engines could produce an astounding 66,500 pounds of thrust. Just to give you a perspective, both the engines combined on a Boeing 737 produce somewhere close to about 55,000 pounds of thrust. The aircraft also has a maximum cruising Mach number of 9, which means it can fly at 90% of the speed of sound. Also, something very interesting that most of you would not know is the Boeing 747 actually had a space for a 5th engine. You could actually carry a spare engine under the left wing between the inboard engine and the fuselage. There's a special place where you can just put one engine which is not working, but if you want to carry one engine from one place to another, you can do that on a 747. Also, Air India, our own national carrier, was amongst the first airlines which ordered the Boeing 747. Aircraft also had a number of accidents, most of which were not attributed to failures of the aircraft. However, there have been 63 hull losses, which means 63 aircrafts have been completely destroyed in various accidents and incidents. However, as times changed and technology improved, airlines eventually discovered that 4-engine aircrafts were not really very commercially and economically viable. There were better options with only 2 engines, which consumed a lot of less fuel and they carried almost as many passengers and even had more range than a 747. As a result, of late, most of the 747 orders were restricted to cargo airlines. For passenger airlines, very few airlines now opt for the Boeing 747, which is why the production has officially ended. In its production run of over 50 years, Boeing produced 1,574 Boeing 747s. And the last one rolled out of the Everest factory. The Boeing 747 will forever be my personal favorite commercial aircraft, something I always dreamt to fly. It'll always be the most iconic aircraft we ever saw, and it'll always be the queen of the skies.